She thought she had everything. A thriving career, a partner she adored, a life carefully built around making everyone else happy. But then, without warning, it all slipped away. This is not just a story of heartbreak and loss. It is the story of what happens when life takes what's yours, and how letting go can open the door to something far greater. Stay with her story until the end, because the lesson she learns may free you too, and the ending may just surprise you.
The mornings always looked perfect from her apartment window. A skyline brushed in muted gold, the city slowly stirring awake. Cars easing down wide avenues, shopkeepers pulling shutters open, the quiet hum before the day's rush. From the outside, it looked like her life was just as polished, orderly, successful, enviable. She was 35, well established in her career, admired among colleagues for her composure and her drive. Friends often called her the one who has it all together. And she worked hard to keep it that way. Every meeting, every dinner, every social gathering, she poured herself into making sure others were comfortable, pleased, and cared for. She adjusted her words to fit what people wanted to hear. She carried their burdens quietly, offering encouragement and support, often at the expense of her own rest. And of course, there was him, Daniel. Tall, ambitious, magnetic in a way that drew people easily toward him. For years, she had thought of him as her anchor. They built routines together, dinners on Friday evenings, long drives on weekends, holidays carefully planned. She wanted to be everything he needed, and so she bent herself around his moods, his preferences, his desires. If he seemed tired, she worked harder to keep the atmosphere light. If he seemed distant, she closed the gap, adjusting her own schedule to match his. Everyone said they looked perfect together. At parties, their friends whispered admiration. "She's so supportive. He's so lucky." And she carried those words like fragile glass, careful never to let the illusion crack. But illusions have weight, and hers was heavy. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside her, wondering if this was love or just effort. She told herself the unease was temporary, that once work slowed down, once the next promotion landed, once they planned the next trip, things would settle. Yet the unease always returned, like a soft current beneath still water, pulling invisibly but firmly. She never spoke of it. To her friends she smiled, to her colleagues she glowed with confidence, to her family she reassured them she was doing well. And to Daniel, she gave everything, silently swallowing doubts, as though ignoring them would make them fade. The break came on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no shattered glass, no storm. Just words spoken with finality, like the closing of a door. "I can't do this anymore," Daniel said, his voice quiet but unyielding. She froze. "Do what?" This, he said, gesturing vaguely between them. "Us."
The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavy. She tried to form words, to find the right argument, the right promise, the right compromise that would make him stay. She reminded him of their years together, their plans, their shared routines. She promised she could change, be better, be more attentive, be whatever he needed. But he shook his head. "That's the problem. You're always changing, always trying to mold yourself to me. I don't even know who you are anymore, and I don't think you do either." the words struck deeper than anger ever could. They carried truth, harsh and undeniable. She stood in silence, heart pounding, hands trembling. There was nothing left to bargain with. Within an hour, he was gone. A suitcase, a closed door, and the echo of footsteps fading down the hall. The first night alone was unbearable. The apartment felt foreign, every object a reminder, every silence a wound. She walked from room to room, unable to sit still. His absence was everywhere. The empty space on the couch, the toothbrush missing from the bathroom sink, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the closet. She clung to her phone, expecting a message, a reconsideration, some crack in his resolve. None came. Sleep did not. By morning she looked at her reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized herself. The eyes red, the expression hollow. She had built her life around stability, around keeping others content, and now, with a single choice she had no power over, it had all unraveled. The days that followed blurred. At work, she forced composure, her smile practiced and steady. Inside, she was unraveling. She replayed their last conversation over and over, dissecting each word, searching for where she had failed. Maybe if she had said less, or said more, maybe if she had done better. She reached for friends, but even their comfort left her restless. They told her she was strong, that she deserved better, that time would heal. She nodded, grateful, but the words slid off the surface of her pain. At night, she stared at the ceiling again, just as before, only now the emptiness beside her was absolute. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was losing the role she had built around him. She had always measured her worth through others, through their approval, their smiles, their satisfaction. With Daniel gone, the mirror shattered. Who was she without someone to please? The question pressed on her chest like a weight, and for the first time, she realized she didn't know the answer. The city outside continued as always. Cars rushed, people hurried, lights blinked across the skyline. Life moved on, indifferent to her grief. She walked through the streets some evenings, letting the hum of the city swallow her thoughts. The world did not pause for her pain. And somehow, in that indifference, she felt both smaller and strangely seen. Her heart ached with longing, but deeper than that, a quiet whisper stirred. Perhaps this is the moment everything begins again.
The morning after he left, she woke before dawn. The apartment was silent, still holding traces of him. The faint scent of his cologne on his scarf, the folded edge of a shirt he'd left behind. Every item she passed seemed to whisper memory. She paused at the kitchen counter, coffee untouched, staring at the empty chair across from her. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails, messages, reminders, but she couldn't focus. Every vibration made her startle. Every alert felt like a signal she might hear from him, or worse, proof that life moved on without her. She opened his social media profile almost unconsciously. Her thumb hovered over the screen, hesitant, afraid, drawn. She scrolled slowly, seeing the absence of her in his posts, the quietness of a life continuing without her presence. Every photo, every caption, every like sent tiny shocks through her chest. She read meaning into things that weren't there, constructing narratives where there were none. Was he happy? Did he already regret leaving? Was she forgotten entirely? The spiral was subtle at first, checking a profile once, then twice,
then constantly, losing hours to observation. She told herself it was harmless, just curiosity, but curiosity quickly became obsession. Her mind replayed their final conversation over and over, dissecting every word. Was it my fault? Could I have been better? Did I love him enough? At work, she became unusually quiet, more withdrawn than her colleagues expected. She smiled and nodded, kept meetings running smoothly, but her mind drifted. Every glance, every sentence from someone else felt laden with judgment. Was she failing at appearing composed? Was she letting others sense the cracks in her armor? By midday, exhaustion settled into her shoulders. She excused herself to the restroom, stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red, dull, rimmed with fatigue. She traced the outline of her face, searching for traces of herself, the confident, capable woman she once believed she was. She found shadows instead, doubt, longing, and an unshakable ache. That evening, she tried calling him. She rehearsed the words in her head for hours. "Please don't go. I can change. I will do better." She imagined him on the line, softening, relenting, coming back. But each time she pressed the call button, her fingers trembled. She hesitated, paused, deleted, then stared at the blank screen. Every attempt felt like a failure before it even began. Instead, she left messages she couldn't send, writing them into her phone notes. Each note was a confession, a plea, a bitter lament. She poured her frustration into words, hoping the act of writing might ease her torment. But it didn't. Each letter, each unsent message was a reminder of the control she didn't have, of the relationship she could no longer influence. Days bled into nights. Routine had collapsed. She found herself wandering the streets late at night, unable to sleep, pacing like a caged animal. The city pulsed around her, lights, sounds, movement, but nothing reached her. Everything felt muted, distant, irrelevant. She tried friends. She called them, texted them, visited them. They offered support, yet their words felt hollow. They reminded her of her worth, told her she was amazing, told her he lost a treasure. And yet each conversation ended with her returning home alone, standing in her apartment, staring at an empty chair and the memories it held. She noticed small moments of irritation building inside her. People's laughter felt grating. Their casual chatter felt like a taunt. She became sensitive to minor slights, perceiving judgment where none existed. Every interaction, every observation, every thought seemed magnified, intensifying the ache she carried.
Work became a refuge and a punishment. She threw herself into projects, meticulously overperforming to fill the void inside. Emails were answered instantly, meetings over-prepared, presentations polished. Colleagues noticed the intensity, remarked on her diligence. She smiled, nodded, said nothing of the storm raging inside. The irony was not lost on her. She sought control at work to compensate for the loss of control in her personal life. Yet control at work could never substitute for the control she lacked in the space that mattered most. Evenings, she replayed every shared memory, every happy moment, every minor disagreement, every word that had led them here. The spiral deepened with each recollection. She couldn't stop herself. Sometimes she wept quietly, hidden in the bathroom or behind closed doors. Sometimes she paced the apartment, hands pressed to her temples, trying to force sense into nonsense. She found herself imagining conversations that would never happen, scenarios in which he returned, apologized, begged for her forgiveness. She rehearsed responses, pleas, and counter-arguments, as if mental rehearsal could bend reality. It never did. Instead, exhaustion compounded, Guilt compounded, and the spiral tightened. She looked around her apartment and saw the artifacts of her attempts to please him. Dinner reservations made months in advance, gifts she thought he'd love, notes left on the fridge, plans scheduled meticulously. All of it now felt meaningless, even absurd. The effort she had expended, the attention she had poured into another's happiness, had not prevented the loss. Anger emerged, first sharp, then dull, at herself for being so vulnerable, at him for leaving, at the world for moving on without pause. She felt betrayed by her own willingness to give, by the illusion that effort alone could dictate outcomes. She recognized the cruel paradox. The more she tried to control, the less control she had. One night she wandered to the park she and Daniel once visited together. The city lights reflected off the lake, and she stood at the edge, silent, shivering slightly in the cool air. She watched a couple walking past, their laughter warm and unguarded. A pang of longing struck her chest, bitter and unrelenting. Yet in that moment, amid the ache, she noticed something else, a feeling of quiet self-awareness. For the first time, she observed herself observing. She felt the spiral, its pull, its patterns, its weight, and for a fleeting instant, she realized that the suffering came not from what had been lost, but from her attachment to outcomes she could never fully control. The thought was fleeting, fragile, easily lost in the next wave of sorrow, but it was there, a seed buried in the rubble of her pain. Over the next days, she began to notice subtle patterns. Every obsessive thought, every compulsive check of his social media, every imagined scenario was a reminder that she had been attempting to control something outside her reach. And the more she tried, the more restless, anxious, and hollow she became. Even at work, she could feel it, a sudden flare of panic when an email went unanswered, tension when a colleague disagreed, agitation when results weren't perfect. Every micro-stress revealed the same truth. Control is an illusion when it resides in the hands of others. She began to experiment quietly. When she felt the urge to check his profile, she paused. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes she failed. But each pause brought a tiny, barely perceptible relief, a momentary reclaiming of agency. At night she lay in bed, eyes open, noticing the rhythm of her own breath. She began a private exercise. When a thought of him arose, she acknowledged it, named it, and returned her attention to the present. Each acknowledgement was a small victory, a reclaiming of her own mental space. Flashbacks surfaced unexpectedly. She remembered their first trip together, laughing under a sunlit bridge. She remembered quiet mornings, drinking coffee, sharing dreams, and the sense of safety she once felt. The memories were bittersweet, sometimes sweet enough to make her smile, often sharp enough to make her chest ache. She realized these moments could exist without defining her entire life. She could carry the memory without letting it imprison her. The spiral, though still present, began to meet resistance. She caught herself mid-thought, mid-panic, mid-compulsion. She began noting patterns, what triggered the obsessive loops, how fatigue amplified the pain, how small acts of deliberate attention eased it. The realization was subtle, almost imperceptible. While she could not control him, she could control her response. She could reclaim the small choices, her morning routine, the way she treated herself, the boundaries she set with others. The process was slow, uneven, and often exhausting, but it was hers. The morning sun filtered through her apartment blinds, scattering slats of gold across the floor. It was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city waking below. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands clasped together, staring at her own reflection in the mirror across the room. The same eyes that had burned with sleepless worry still looked back at her, but something was different. There was a small, subtle awareness, as if the storm inside her had stirred something that might, eventually, settle. The nights of endless checking and obsessive thought had begun to take a toll. She recognized the loops now, the way her mind spiraled back to him, parsing every word, every glance, every moment they had shared. And yet, for the first time, she noticed them. She could name the compulsion, label the thought, and consciously decide whether to follow it or not. It was not mastery, far from it, but awareness was the first step. At work, she attempted to focus. Meetings felt less like performances and more like obligations she could navigate on her own terms. She stopped obsessively seeking approval from colleagues. When someone disagreed with her point of view, she noticed a spike of tension in her chest, but she allowed it to pass, quietly reminding herself that disagreement did not define her worth. A week in, she began small experiments in reclaiming her time. She left work a little earlier, ignoring the twinges of guilt that whispered she should stay late, work harder, prove her value. She started skipping certain social obligations she had previously attended out of obligation or fear of judgment. Each small boundary was a revelation, each refusal a tiny act of self-possession. Evenings became her sanctuary. She took long walks through her neighborhood, feeling the city beneath her feet, breathing in the crisp air. At first, the walks were empty of joy. They were merely a necessity to move, to escape the apartment that had become both prison and memory vault. One morning, as she rounded a familiar corner, she noticed a man walking in the opposite direction. He had a calm presence, tall, composed, yet approachable. Their paths crossed briefly, a polite nod exchanged. She continued walking, but a small spark of recognition lingered. Not recognition of him, but of something else, the possibility of life existing beyond her current pain. At home, she began journaling, not as a way to plead, argue, or analyze him, but to pour out her own thoughts and feelings without expectation. She wrote of heartbreak, frustration, and exhaustion, but she also noted moments of clarity, subtle shifts in perception. She described the compulsion she had noticed, the moments when she caught herself spiraling, and the small victories of returning to her own center. The journal became a mirror of her own agency. She could see patterns forming, repeated behaviors, and she began experimenting in interrupting them. When she felt the urge to check his social media, she wrote instead. When she wanted to rehearse a conversation, she spoke aloud to herself, framing it as reflection rather than negotiation. Each small act was a reclaiming of her own space. Friends remained supportive, though their words now resonated differently. She could hear their encouragement without leaning on it. She could accept it as gentle guidance rather than a lifeline. One evening, a close friend remarked, "You seem calmer, different somehow." She realized she was, not completely healed, far from it, but beginning to inhabit her own rhythm. She recognized that the ache of heartbreak did not have to define every moment. She could move through it with attention, intention, and above all, presence.
Work presented both challenge and opportunity. A demanding project landed on her desk, one she could have obsessed over in the past. Previously, she would have worked frantically, trying to control every outcome, bending over backward to anticipate every need of every stakeholder. This time, she approached it differently. She focused on her own actions, her preparation, her integrity, her communication. She could not control how others received it, nor could she control the variables beyond her scope. She finished the project on time, with diligence, and while some elements were imperfect, she felt no need to apologize, over-explain, or overcompensate. The satisfaction was subtle, but profound. A quiet proof that exerting effort without attachment to outcomes could feel lighter and freer. Her walks became meditative rituals. One morning, she noticed the same man from before. This time, he smiled as their paths crossed. She returned the gesture. Over several weeks, these encounters became familiar, predictable, and somehow grounding. Their conversations started briefly, whether routine, small talk, but slowly grew. He asked her about her walks, her favorite spots, what she noticed in the city. She spoke honestly, without embellishment, without trying to impress. These small interactions revealed something she had forgotten. Presence itself could be captivating. She did not need to shape herself to please. Simply being grounded and attentive was enough. Evenings now included deliberate practices. She would sit in silence, reflecting on her day, her actions, her emotions. She noted moments of agitation or obsession and asked herself gently, "Could I have controlled this? Should I?" Often the answer was no. She had spent years chasing control over others, their feelings, their attention. She saw clearly now that such control was never hers to wield. She also noticed patterns in her emotions. Anger flared when she felt powerless. Anxiety surged when she imagined the future. But she learned small methods to redirect those energies. Breathing, walking, journaling. Simple techniques that allowed her to inhabit her own body and mind, rather than be carried by reactive currents. The realization began to crystallize. While she could not change the past, she could shape her present moment, and that, in turn, would influence her future. The lesson was small, fragile, but luminous. She felt a sliver of freedom, a faint awareness that agency existed where she had never sought it before. She revisited memories with clarity instead of compulsion. Sitting on her balcony one evening, she remembered quiet nights with Daniel, the laughter, the shared dreams, the comfort. She felt both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for the moments she had experienced, sorrow for the ones that were lost. Unlike before, the memories did not trigger panic or obsession. They were recognized, accepted, and allowed to exist without demanding action or judgment. This was a turning point. She realized her attachment to outcomes had fueled much of her suffering. By accepting what had been, and by focusing on her own choices moving forward, she could navigate life with steadiness. In small ways, she began reclaiming joy. A new cafe she had noticed on her walks became a place to sit with a cup of tea, watching people pass, noting details she had overlooked in her prior rush to please others. A friend invited her to a small gathering, and she attended, not out of obligation, but choice. She laughed freely, without crafting herself to fit others' expectations. She felt lighter, not unburdened, not healed, but capable of movement, capable of choosing, capable of living without being dragged entirely by external forces. One morning, on her usual walk, she passed the same man again. Their greetings were now familiar, comfortable. This time, he lingered slightly, commenting on the sunrise, the rhythm of the city, the quiet in the streets. She responded genuinely, noticing the ease of a conversation unburdened by expectation. A subtle thought crossed her mind. Perhaps life can still surprise me. It was not longing for him or for something lost. It was openness. She did not know what would come, who would come, or what would change. But she could inhabit her own presence fully, and that presence itself invited life to enter in ways she had never allowed before.
Morning light seeped through the blinds, warmer now than it had been weeks ago. She awoke with a strange stillness in her chest. Not complete relief, not joy, but something steadier, quieter than she had felt since Daniel left. The obsessive tension that had consumed her nights had eased slightly.
A recognition had settled in. While she could not change the past, she could influence how she met each moment. She dressed for her walk and stepped outside, the city slowly stirring beneath her feet. Each step, she noticed, carried weight, yet also momentum, a subtle reminder that movement itself is a form of agency. She did not have control over Daniel's absence, the opinions of friends, or the direction of her career, but she could choose how she walked, how she breathed, and how she met the day. Her first breakthrough came unexpectedly at work. A colleague challenged a project she had poured hours into. In the past, she would have felt a rush of panic, a need to justify, explain, and overcompensate. This time, she paused. She acknowledged the critique without defensiveness, listened fully, and responded with clarity and composure. Later, she reflected on the incident in her journal. I cannot control their judgment. I can control my response. The simplicity of it struck her. Years of struggle had stemmed from trying to control outcomes that were never hers to manage. Recognition alone did not erase the ache, but it shifted the frame. She was no longer entirely at the mercy of external circumstances. At home, her evening walks became intentional. The man she had glimpsed before, the one with the calm presence, was now a familiar figure. Their conversations began slowly, each interaction a small step in rebuilding her comfort with connection. He was attentive without overbearing, successful without arrogance, grounded without rigidity. One morning, he commented on a book she carried, a simple journal full of her reflections. They spoke briefly about writing as a form of self-observation, and she felt a flicker of surprise. The conversation was easy, without expectation or pretense. She did not need to impress. She simply existed, and her presence was enough. Her nights now included intentional reflection. She wrote freely, documenting moments of clarity, small victories, and areas of struggle. One evening, she paused mid-sentence and looked at her reflection in the journal's dark window. She noticed tension in her shoulders, yes, but also steadiness in her posture, in her gaze. A quiet recognition emerged. I am not the same person who clung to outcomes. I am becoming someone who inhabits her own presence. She reread passages from prior weeks, messages she had written but not sent, obsessive notes, self-recriminations. The difference was stark. What had once been fuel for spiraling anxiety now appeared as lessons, markers of her evolution. She had endured, observed, and survived the storm of attachment. She had begun reclaiming herself.
The man on her walks began to appear more often, as if coincidence had arranged their paths. They shared moments without pretense, observing the city waking, commenting on architecture, noting the morning light. One day, he remarked on the rhythm of her steps, steady, mindful, deliberate. She felt seen not for her efforts to please, but for simply being. This realization carried subtle power. She had always believed approval was earned through action, attention, and adaptation. Now she understood the quiet strength of presence. She did not need to shape herself for others. She could shape herself and let life respond. At work, she began setting small boundaries. Meetings ended on her schedule when appropriate. She refused last-minute tasks that would compromise her well-being. Colleagues noticed, some surprised, others respectful. Each act of self-possession reinforced the lesson she had learned on her walks and in her journal. Control begins with oneself. She also noticed emotional triggers with clarity. When envy or irritation arose, she observed it rather than reacting. If she felt a surge of anxiety about Daniel, she acknowledged the thought, let it pass, and returned her focus to what she could influence. her breath, her walk, her tasks, her reflection. Friends became companions in a new sense. She still shared selectively, without seeking validation. When they offered support, she accepted it gratefully, but without dependence. Conversations felt reciprocal rather than transactional. She realized relationships could exist without sacrificing self-possession. One evening, a friend asked how she managed to seem so composed despite everything. She paused, smiled faintly, and said, "I'm learning to focus on what I can control and let go of the rest." The words felt true, even if the practice remained a work in progress. Gradually, she experimented with intentional joy. She visited cafes she had ignored, lingered in parks, watched street performers without hurry or distraction. Small pleasures emerged in observation, the pattern of leaves, the hum of traffic, laughter in the distance. She was not escaping her grief, but weaving presence into her grief, allowing moments of life to exist alongside the ache. The encounters with the man grew subtly meaningful. They began sharing observations about the city, the way sunlight hit a building in the early morning, the rhythm of people moving, the quiet resilience in everyday life. He asked about her routines, her reflections. She responded honestly, without embellishment or effort to impress. Through these interactions, she recognized a simple truth: connection does not require manipulation or self-effacement. Authenticity invites presence in others. And in noticing this, she felt a flicker of hope. Hope that relationships could exist without surrendering herself. She began noticing the difference in her own perception. Where she had once seen obstacles, she now saw patterns. Where she had felt powerless, she now saw leverage in her choices. Where she had spiraled, she now paused. In her journal, she wrote, "I cannot control Daniel. I cannot control how the world sees me or how life unfolds, but I can control my attention, my actions, my presence, and that is enough." The statement felt like a stone dropped into still water, rippling quietly, subtly altering her inner landscape. The mornings had changed. Light now fell in gentle gold across her apartment, no longer harsh or alarming, no longer a reminder of absence. She awoke before dawn, not with dread, but with a subtle awareness of life moving in rhythm with her own breath. The panic that had once seized her chest upon waking had softened, replaced with a quiet curiosity about the day ahead. Her first cup of tea was no longer a ritual of escape, but of observation. She sat by the window, listening to the city below, the hum of traffic, the distant murmur of early conversations, the faint bird song threading through the streets. She noticed with a sense of calm that the world was neither cruel nor kind. It simply moved, and in that motion she found space to move herself. Work had become a canvas for presence rather than performance. Tasks that would often be sources of stress were now opportunities to exercise judgment, diligence, and patience. She no longer tied her self-worth to the outcome of every project. Instead, she focused on what she could control: her effort, her clarity, her attention. A meeting with a demanding client presented a familiar challenge. Previously, she would have bent herself to anticipate every whim, every question, every expectation. Now she entered the room grounded, listening carefully, responding deliberately. When the client expressed dissatisfaction with one minor detail, she acknowledged it calmly and proposed a reasonable solution. The client left the meeting satisfied, but even if they hadn't, she felt no collapse of self-worth. The realization settled into her. She could act with excellence without being a prisoner of outcomes. Control was internal, not external. The morning walks had become sacred again. She and the man she had encountered weeks before now greeted each other with familiarity. Conversations had grown longer, richer, though still casual. He asked her about her reflections on the city, her routines, her observations of life. She responded openly, without embellishment or pretense. One morning, he said, "You notice things most people overlook. There's a clarity in how you see the city." She smiled, realizing that for the first time in months, approval from another felt natural rather than necessary. It was recognition, not validation. Back at home, she cultivated small rituals of self-care and reflection. Journaling became more than venting, it was a map of her growth. She recorded moments of clarity, choices that reflected her agency, and instances where she had paused instead of spiraled. She began reflecting on her emotions with curiosity rather than judgment. Anger, sadness, longing, all were acknowledged as natural responses, not flaws. Anxiety became a signal to observe, breathe, and redirect attention to what could be influenced. In these small practices, she found a new form of freedom, emotional resilience, born not of avoidance, but of engagement.
Social interactions evolved as well. Invitations that she would have previously accepted out of obligation were now filtered through intention. She attended gatherings that sparked joy, declined those that would drain energy. Each choice reinforced her growing autonomy, her ability to inhabit her own life without constantly negotiating for the comfort or approval of others. She began to notice subtle shifts in perception. Where she once saw obstacles, she now saw opportunities. Where she once felt powerless, she now felt leverage in her own decisions. Where she once spiraled, she now paused, observed, and acted deliberately. The man on her walks became a consistent presence, though still casual. They shared small stories of past experiences, reflections on their routines, observations of the city as it shifted from morning quiet to midday bustle. Each interaction felt authentic. She noticed herself smiling freely, laughing easily, speaking with honesty. For the first time in months, she felt energy that was entirely her own, not borrowed from external approval, not earned through performance, but grown from steady self-attention. One evening, she paused at a bench in the park, looking at her reflection in the water. The city lights shimmered across the surface, fragmented and fluid. She considered the months that had passed, the heartbreak, the obsessive spirals, the sleepless nights, the lessons that had emerged through reflection. She realized she had learned something profound. While she could not control others, she could control her presence, her attention, her choices, and in controlling these, she could navigate life with grace and resilience. At work, she received recognition for her steady, thoughtful approach. Colleagues remarked on her composure, her ability to handle pressure, her clarity in communication. The accolades felt different now, not a lifeline of worth, but a gentle acknowledgement of effort and presence. She also noticed something else. The confidence she had cultivated quietly influenced others. People responded to her steadiness. They mirrored it. Where she had once bent herself to manage relationships, she now saw that presence itself could guide and shape interactions naturally. Evenings were now rich with intentionality. She cooked meals she enjoyed, read for pleasure rather than self-improvement, and explored parts of the city she had overlooked. Each step, each small act became a practice of autonomy and mindfulness. The man from her walks began walking with her more frequently. They discussed favorite corners of the city, quiet cafes,
fleeting observations of life passing by. One morning, as they watched the sun glint across a glass building, he said, "There's a serenity in how you approach life. It's inspiring." She realized with a quiet smile that he did not inspire this in her, she had cultivated it herself. His recognition was not a mirror to her worth, but a reflection of her presence. The awareness deepened. Life is composed of what can be controlled and what cannot. Desire, attachment, and worry for the uncontrollable only create suffering. Action, attention, and presence within one's own sphere generate freedom and joy. She practiced this not as doctrine, but as lived experience. She observed her own thought patterns. When worry arose, she acknowledged it. When attachment flared, she stepped back. When grief pressed, she welcomed it as a natural response, rather than a prison. The change was subtle, but cumulative. Each day built upon the last, a quiet layering of resilience, clarity, and self-possession. One evening, she arrived at the park early. The city bathed in the warm tones of sunset. The man approached carrying a thermos of tea and offered her a cup. They sat together on a bench, drinking slowly, watching the city exhale. She felt something shift, not dramatically, but profoundly. She realized that presence, steadiness, and attention had created a space where connection could be authentic. She had learned patience, endurance, and the quiet power of being herself. For the first time in months, she felt fully seen, fully grounded, and entirely capable of moving forward.
The mornings had begun to feel like her own. Light spilled in gently across the floor, no longer harsh, no longer a reminder of absence. She woke naturally, breathing in the rhythm of the city below, aware of the quiet spaces between sounds. She noticed how the simple act of waking without anxiety felt like a triumph she had long forgotten could exist. She dressed slowly, choosing clothes not to impress anyone, but because they suited her comfort and expression. The small act of self-attention had become a daily practice, acknowledging her needs, noticing her surroundings, and deciding intentionally how to move through the world. Work remained a test of her newfound clarity. Previously, she would have bent herself into knots to satisfy everyone's expectations. This week, she faced a complex project with multiple stakeholders. Instead of attempting to control every interaction, she focused on her own contributions, preparation, clarity of communication, and thoughtful engagement. When a colleague raised concerns about her approach, she paused, listened, and responded without defensiveness. She realized the subtle truth. She could act with excellence, but she could not control perceptions or outcomes. This distinction, once abstract, now felt lived. Her effort was hers. The rest belonged to the world. Her evening walks had grown into quiet rituals of presence. The man she had encountered weeks ago now greeted her with warmth and ease. Their conversations expanded, moving beyond pleasantries into reflections on life, purpose, and shared observations. She noticed that she no longer sought approval, nor did she craft herself to impress anyone. Her presence, simply as herself, was enough. One morning, he remarked, "I can see the world differently when I walk with you. You notice details others miss." She smiled inwardly. Presence, she realized, could be magnetic, not in a manipulative sense, but as a natural expression of attention and awareness. Her previous attempts to please, to sculpt herself for others, had obscured this quiet strength. Evenings were now rich with reflection and intention. She journaled daily, noting victories,
challenges, and patterns in her emotional life. She recorded moments when she had resisted compulsive thought, when she had acted deliberately instead of reactively. She acknowledged lingering grief and frustration, not as weaknesses, but as natural companions of human experience. Through writing, she saw her own evolution unfold. Patterns she had once found overwhelming now appeared as familiar markers guiding her understanding of herself and the world. She noticed subtle shifts in her attention. She could pause before reacting, choose presence over compulsion, and focus on what truly mattered. Social interactions were evolving too. Invitations that once felt obligatory were now consciously chosen. She attended gatherings that sparked joy and declined those that would have drained her. Each decision reinforced the lesson she had begun to live. Freedom lies in knowing what one can influence and gracefully letting go of what one cannot. Through these choices, she began to notice an inner strength that once seemed elusive. Confidence was no longer a borrowed commodity, but something cultivated daily.
Her encounters with the man became a source of calm delight. They shared observations about the city, quiet reflections about human nature, and laughter that felt effortless. For the first time in months, she noticed her own smile arriving naturally, not as a performance. Connection felt possible without surrendering herself, without manipulating outcomes. They began to share small routines, meeting at a certain corner for morning walks, pausing at favorite cafes, observing the patterns of life passing by. Each interaction became a mirror of presence and attentiveness, reinforcing the lesson she had begun to embody. She also started noticing the subtler aspects of control and release. When anger or envy arose, she allowed herself to observe it, label it, and then let it pass without spiraling. Anxiety became a signal to refocus on her own actions and attention rather than on imagined consequences. The practice of observing without attachment was becoming second nature. In her journal, she wrote, "I cannot shape the world to my desires, but I can shape my own attention, and that is enough." This simple principle guided every decision, every interaction, every moment of reflection. Slowly, it became a lived experience rather than an abstract idea. One afternoon, she encountered an unexpected challenge at work. A client was dissatisfied with a long-planned proposal. Her initial instinct to panic surfaced, but she recognized it immediately. She inhaled, grounded herself, and responded with clear communication, proposing a reasonable solution. She did not apologize excessively, over-explain, or attempt to control the client's emotional reaction. The meeting concluded with mutual satisfaction. She realized the subtle triumph. Her effort was fully present, yet she did not tether her worth to the outcome. She had learned to act with agency, not attachment. Evenings continued to reinforce these lessons. She cooked meals with care, observed the small details in her surroundings, and reflected on the day's challenges and triumphs. She noticed growth in subtle ways: steadier posture, calmer speech, more intentional gaze, a sense of alignment between thought, action, and presence. She also began noticing the nuances in her emotional responses. Where panic once overtook her, she now allowed curiosity and awareness to guide her. Grief remained, but it no longer dictated behavior. Presence had become a tool, a shield, and a pathway to clarity. Her walks with the man became deeper in both conversation and shared awareness. They spoke of values, goals, fears, and hopes. Each interaction reinforced her confidence, her ability to connect without attachment, and the authenticity of her presence. The connection was unforced, natural, and mutually respectful, a stark contrast to the pattern she had carried in past relationships. One evening, as they watched the sunset together, he said, Being with you feels effortless. I can see who you are without any pretension." She realized, again, that this ease was not something he created. It was the result of the work she had done, cultivating presence, observing patterns, focusing on her own actions, and letting go of control over others. At home, she reflected on the months of growth. She observed the changes in her approach to work, relationships, and life. Her agency was now palpable, a quiet confidence that did not demand attention, but naturally drew it. She could navigate the world with composure and clarity, knowing that she had influence over herself and presence in every moment. She wrote in her journal, "I am learning that love, joy, and freedom are born from presence, not pursuit. The world responds to the calm and steadiness within me, not to my efforts to control it." Small joys became a regular part of life. She noticed the beauty in simple moments, a breeze on her face, sunlight through a window, laughter in the street, the quiet rhythm of the city. Life no longer felt like a series of trials or tests, but a canvas for presence and engagement. She began to notice herself smiling more easily, laughing more freely, and interacting authentically with colleagues, friends, and strangers alike. The practices of awareness, reflection, and attention had created a foundation from which joy could naturally arise.
The morning air carried a subtle warmth as she stepped onto the familiar streets of the city. Each breath felt intentional, each movement deliberate. The months of reflection and practice had built an awareness that permeated even the smallest acts. She walked with steadiness, noticing the rhythm of her steps, the hum of the city, the interplay of shadow and light on the buildings. The man she had met on her walks was already there, waiting with a quiet smile. Their greetings had grown natural, without pretense or expectation. They fell into the rhythm of walking together, talking and observing without forcing connection, letting presence carry the day. As the city awakened, she reflected on the subtle changes in herself. She no longer sought approval through performance, no longer measured self-worth by outcomes she could not control. Her life was now grounded in agency. She had control over her attention, her actions, and the choices she made. This clarity extended to her relationship. She realized that authentic connection requires both presence and freedom. She could choose to engage fully while respecting both her own boundaries and his. Love, she understood, was not a rescue from pain, but an expansion of shared awareness. Over the next few weeks, their walks became opportunities for reflection and discovery. They shared thoughts on ambition, values, and the little marvels of urban life. A quiet intimacy emerged, a companionship built on respect, honesty, and mutual growth. She found herself laughing easily, speaking freely, and observing his responses without compulsion to impress. She noticed that her energy, once consumed by worry and attachment, now flowed into connection, creativity, and engagement. Her attention was no longer divided by anxious anticipation, but directed toward meaningful moments and deliberate action. Work continued to provide both challenge and opportunity. She now approached projects with intentionality rather than compulsion. Decisions were measured, interactions were calm and considered. She noticed colleagues responding to her newfound steadiness with trust and respect. In contrast to the anxious patterns of her past, she now guided with presence rather than dominance. One day, a particularly high-pressure project arose. She recognized the familiar stirrings of stress, but paused, grounding herself in what she could control. The outcome, she reminded herself, was beyond her reach, but her effort, clarity, and communication were hers to manage. The project succeeded, but even if it hadn't, she felt no collapse of self-worth. She had learned the quiet power of agency. Evenings became sacred again. She and the man occasionally lingered in cafes, observing life passing by, sharing observations, and savoring small moments. They discovered shared joys, quiet reading corners, benches in parks, and unhurried conversations over tea. These simple pleasures, once overlooked, now became markers of contentment and connection. Her rapport deepened naturally. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky in warm hues, he remarked, "Being with you feels effortless, like we're both just present in the moment." She realized he spoke truthfully. Effortless presence was no gift he created, it was cultivated within herself. Her growth allowed for authentic connection, free from manipulation, performance, or expectation.
At home, her journal became a place to reflect on these shifts. She recorded moments of joy, instances of deliberate action, and reflections on connection and growth. She noted the differences between past patterns and present presence. Anxiety still appeared occasionally. Grief sometimes lingered, formed, steady, present, self-possessed, and open to connection without surrendering agency. Social interactions beyond her walks also evolved. She engaged selectively in events that aligned with her energy, declined obligations that drained her, and cultivated conversations that inspired curiosity. Friendships became richer and less transactional, built on mutual respect rather than performance. Through this intentional living, she experienced a subtle but pervasive sense of freedom. Freedom from external validation, from compulsive worry, and from the weight of past attachment. Her attention, once scattered by the need to please, was now fully invested in meaningful engagement. The city itself felt transformed. Where she had once seen chaos or indifference, she now saw layers of life, moments of beauty, and opportunities for observation and reflection. Each step, each interaction, each quiet pause became an opportunity to practice agency and presence. Her internal dialogue had shifted profoundly. Where panic once dominated, calm reflection now prevailed. Where obsession had gripped her, mindful attention guided her. Where grief lingered, acceptance allowed space for both feeling and release. Her walks with the man became intertwined with exploration and subtle ritual. They discovered favorite routes, overlooked street corners, quiet gardens, and sunlit cafes. Each shared observation, each laughter-filled moment reinforced the authenticity of their connection. Neither needed to impress or manipulate. Both simply existed in alignment with their values and attention. Through these interactions, she experienced a quiet joy she had thought impossible months before. Presence, attention, and agency had created fertile ground for love, authenticity, and fulfillment. The weeks passed with a gentle rhythm. She balanced work, reflection, and connection effortlessly. Each day became an affirmation of the lessons she had lived. Control only extends to oneself. Presence carries meaning. Attachment to outcomes breeds suffering. Intentional action creates freedom. She felt herself flourishing. Confidence arose naturally from daily practice rather than external validation. Joy emerged from observation and engagement rather than circumstance. Love began to unfold not as rescue or distraction, but as an authentic reflection of shared presence. One morning, they paused on a bridge overlooking the river. The sun glinted across the water, shimmering in constant motion. She felt a deep sense of alignment, the culmination of months of reflection, growth, and self-possession. He reached for her hand, not to claim, but to accompany. In that gesture, she recognized the embodiment of all she had learned. Love could flourish without compromise, connection could exist without attachment, and joy could arise naturally from presence. Returning home that evening, she reflected on the arc of her journey. The heartbreak that had once defined her life now felt like a threshold, an initiation that led her to resilience, awareness,
and authentic connection. She recognized the quiet triumph in choosing presence, cultivating agency, and embracing what could be controlled. She journaled her reflections. Through heartbreak, I discovered freedom. Through reflection, I cultivated presence. Through letting go, I discovered love that aligns with who I am. Life is not about control over others, but mastery over self.
The mornings were calm. Light spilled softly across the room, illuminating the subtle textures of the city through the window. She moved through her routine with intention, not haste. Breakfast was prepared mindfully. The aroma of fresh tea filled the air. She paused, inhaling deeply, savoring the moment without anticipation or distraction. Her life now carried a rhythm shaped by presence, reflection, and deliberate attention. Work, once a source of relentless pressure, was now a space for thoughtful action. Tasks were approached methodically, challenges met with calm deliberation. She had learned to focus on what she could control, releasing the rest into the flow of life. Her relationship had deepened naturally. The man she met on her walks had become a true partner, respectful, attentive, and equally invested in authenticity. Their connection was effortless, grounded in mutual presence rather than expectation. They shared mornings wandering the city streets, afternoons visiting quiet cafes, and evenings reflecting together on life's subtle moments. Laughter and conversation flowed without need for pretense. The ease between them was a reflection of the inner calm she had cultivated. One evening, sitting together by the river as the sun dipped behind the skyline, he reached for her hand. The gesture was simple, unforced, and profound in its quiet intimacy. She felt no anxiety, no compulsion, no need to perform. Presence alone carried the weight of meaning. She realized that love, when built on self-possession, presence, and respect for what one can control, flourished naturally. Connection was no longer a negotiation for validation, but a shared experience of authenticity. Work-life balance had become intuitive. She prioritized tasks and social interactions based on intention rather than obligation. She engaged fully where presence mattered and let go where influence did not extend. The freedom to choose had created a life rich with autonomy, satisfaction, and joy. Her internal dialogue had shifted completely. Anxiety and compulsion no longer dominated. When grief arose, it was acknowledged, processed, and released. When doubt appeared, it was observed and redirected. Clarity and agency guided her decisions, her interactions, and her engagement with life. The city had transformed in her perception. Where chaos or indifference had once ruled, she now saw layers of beauty, possibility, and human experience. She noticed small details: sunlight glinting off windows, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the laughter of strangers. Life itself had become an intimate canvas on which she could practice attention and presence. Her partner noticed the change too. He admired the calm authority and presence she brought into each interaction. "Being with you feels effortless," he said one afternoon, "like we're simply inhabiting life together without the weight of expectation." She smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. It was not his doing. It was the embodiment of her own practice, cultivated through months of reflection, presence, and agency. Evenings were spent in intentional rituals, cooking meals, observing the city, journaling reflections, and sharing quiet conversations. Each act reinforced the integration of lessons learned, letting go of control over others, cultivating presence, and embracing what could be influenced. Her energy she had never experienced in months of past heartbreak. Joy was not dependent on outcomes or approval, but arose naturally from the harmony between her intentions, actions, and awareness.
Their walks evolved into shared discoveries. They explored parks, hidden streets, and quiet cafes. Conversations deepened, touching on hopes, fears, values, and aspirations. Each exchange reinforced mutual respect, shared presence, and authentic connection. She noticed that love could flourish without compromise, that intimacy could exist without surrendering self-possession. The transformation she had cultivated allowed both to engage fully, without attachment or expectation. The culmination of her growth became evident in the subtle rhythms of daily life. She observed. Emotional resilience had replaced compulsive anxiety. Presence had replaced obsessive longing. Agency had replaced the need for validation. Joy had replaced fear. Connection had replaced isolation. Through these transformations, she now inhabited a life that was richer, freer, and more fulfilling than she could have imagined months before. One crisp morning, as they walked through the park and sunlight shimmered across the river, he paused. "I feel like we're on the same path," he said. "Not because I'm trying to lead or guide, but because we're both fully present." She squeezed his hand, understanding fully. Presence, attention, and agency had created the space for this connection to thrive. Love had arrived not as a distraction, not as rescue, but as a reflection of their authentic selves. Her journal reflected these final insights. The heartbreak was not an end, but a threshold. Through letting go, through presence, through focusing on what I can control, life has opened to joy, love, and freedom. Connection is richest when I am grounded in myself. Life unfolds beautifully when I act with intention, presence, and agency. The words were no longer aspiration, they were lived reality. She noticed small miracles daily: the warmth of sunlight, laughter shared, a quiet conversation, or the reflection of city lights on water. Each moment reinforced the truth that life, when lived intentionally and with awareness, is abundant. She had learned to let go of what she could not control. In doing so, she had gained everything: resilience, peace, joy, and love that reflected her own growth and presence.
As she walked through the city, hand in hand with someone who mirrored her presence and respect, remember this: your journey too is shaped by what you can control. Every deliberate choice, every moment of presence, every act of letting go brings you closer to resilience, joy, and authentic connection. If you stayed this long, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe for more Stoic-inspired journeys. Like if this story resonated with you, and share it with someone who could use a reminder that letting go can lead to unexpected happiness. And when you're ready, listen to another story to continue exploring how presence, reflection, and self-possession can transform everyday life.